Imagine standing in total darkness, somewhere between midnight and dawn, pressed against the cold observation slit of a concrete bunker perched on a bluff above the English Channel. The fog rolls in off the water, and the only sounds are the distant crash of waves and the hum of your own breathing. You've been staring at this horizon for months. Nothing ever comes. Tonight feels different. That is where we find Major Werner Pluskat on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, an artillery officer in his early 30s, commanding the 1st Battalion of Artillery Regiment 352, part of the German 352nd Infantry Division, the very unit tasked with holding what the Allies had quietly codenamed Omaha Beach. He didn't know that name. He knew only that his guns covered a stretch of Norman coastline that his commanders had told him was one of the most heavily defended sectors in all of Western Europe. Tonight, history was going to knock on his door, whether he was ready or not. The man and the wall he defended. Werner Pluskat was born in 1912, which put him at 31 years old when the 352nd Infantry Division was formed in occupied France in late November 1943. The division had been raised as part of a German high command order to create 10 new infantry divisions to replace catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front. These were supposed to be combat-ready formations by May 1944, with the expectation that they'd eventually be transferred east to feed the grinding machine of the Russian campaign. Instead, by March 1944, with the growing certainty of an Allied invasion somewhere along the western coast of Europe, the 352nd received new orders. They were going nowhere. They were staying in Normandy, and they were going to hold the coast. The division was placed under Generalleutnant Dietrich Kreis, a capable and experienced commander. Of the roughly 12,020 men in the division, around 6,800 were seasoned combat troops, some of them veterans who had actually fought on the Eastern Front, men who had seen what real war looked like and survived it. This was not a garrison force of exhausted old men and teenage conscripts, which is what Allied intelligence had expected to find on this particular stretch of beach. That misidentification would cost thousands of American lives. As for Pluskat's specific role, he commanded artillery. His guns were positioned inland from the bluffs, their barrels pre-sighted on the beach below when the water's approaching it. For weeks, his crews had calculated firing solutions on the open sand, on the waterline, on the approach corridors that any invading fleet would need to use. Every inch of that beach had already been assigned to a specific gun, a specific shell trajectory. If the Allies came ashore at Omaha, they were walking into a geometric nightmare of overlapping fire that had been prepared with cold, mathematical precision. But those guns only mattered if the invasion actually came. And in the spring of 1944, with the Atlantic Wall bristling behind him, with minefields on the sand and steel obstacles jutting from the surf, there was still a debate raging among German commanders about whether the defenses were enough, or even whether Normandy was really where the blow would fall. The wall, the philosophy, and the fatal debate. To understand what Werner Pluskat was defending that night, you have to understand what the Atlantic Wall actually was, and what it wasn't. German propaganda had spent years describing it as an impenetrable barrier, a fortress of steel and concrete stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was given command of Army Group B and tasked with preparing those coastal defenses in early 1944, described the reality of what he found in far less flattering terms. He called the wall a product of what he called Wolkenkuckucksheim, Cloud Cuckoo Land, an enormous bluff built more to reassure the German public than to actually stop an Allied invasion. When Rommel arrived and began his inspection tours in late 1943, he found huge gaps, half-finished bunkers, insufficient minefields, and defenses that would crumble under serious naval bombardment. He set about fixing it with characteristic energy. By the spring of 1944, construction had intensified dramatically. The Atlantic Wall came to incorporate an estimated 15,000 reinforced concrete structures of various types: munitions bunkers, artillery combat positions, infantry fighting positions, observation posts, and command centers. Over 5 million mines had been laid along the French coast. Underwater obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes tipped with mines, concrete ramps designed to tear the bottoms out of landing craft, had been planted in rows across the tidal zones. At Omaha specifically, the terrain itself was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. A narrow tidal flat of sand backed by a low seawall in shingle bank. Beyond the shingle, the ground rose sharply toward a series of bluffs between 30 and 50 meters high. Those bluffs completely dominated the beach below. Machine gun positions had been cut into the bluffs and sited to deliver what military planners call enfilade fire, sweeping along the length of the beach rather than straight out to sea, so that there was no angle of approach that wasn't covered. There were 13 hardened strongpoints called Widerstandsnester, or resistance nests, packed with machine guns, mortars, artillery pieces, and communication bunkers, all connected by a network of trenches. Rommel's personal philosophy on how to use these defenses was blunt and direct. He believed Germany could only win by stopping any Allied landing right at the waterline in the first hours of any assault. As he famously put it, the first 24 hours of the invasion would be decisive. If the Allies established a beachhead and started pouring men and equipment ashore, the Wehrmacht could not win a sustained battle of attrition. The clock was always running against Germany. Stop them on the beach or lose the war. And yet, for all his energy, Rommel was away from his command post on the morning of June 6th. He had gone back to Germany for his wife's birthday and to petition Hitler directly for more panzer divisions. The weather reports coming out of the Luftwaffe Meteorological Center in Paris had predicted 2 weeks of stormy conditions considered far too rough for a large-scale amphibious landing. He was confident the invasion wasn't coming that particular weekend. That confidence would prove to be one of the most consequential miscalculations of the war. The greatest deception in military history. The reason Werner Pluskat and every other German officer on that coast was caught so completely off guard had almost nothing to do with luck. It was the product of years of meticulous, extraordinarily complex Allied deception operations that have been running since 1943. The umbrella operation was called Operation Bodyguard, a name taken from a remark by Winston Churchill that in wartime, truth is so precious she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. The core of Bodyguard's effort was a sub-operation called Operation Fortitude, specifically Fortitude South, which had one main goal: convince German High Command that the primary Allied invasion would hit at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Pas-de-Calais made the most logical sense from a purely military standpoint. It was the shortest crossing of the English Channel, the most direct route into Germany, and it was where the Germans already had their heaviest concentrations of defensive troops. The Allies fed this expectation obsessively. A fictional army group, the First United States Army Group, or FUSAG, was constructed on paper and in radio traffic, supposedly massed in Kent and Sussex, and preparing to cross directly to Calais. Its commanding general was none other than George S. Patton, the commander the German military feared and respected above all others. Fake camps were built with inflatable tanks and trucks. Double agents who had been turned to work for British intelligence fed fabricated intelligence to their German handlers for months, building a picture of an invasion that was never coming. Radio traffic was carefully managed to simulate the communications patterns of a massive army in preparation. The result was staggering. By June 1944, the Germans were obliged to defend an enormous stretch of coastline without knowing where the real blow would fall. Most of their best units, including the 15th Army with roughly 150,000 troops, were sitting in the Pas-de-Calais area waiting for an attack that wasn't coming. Even after the Normandy landings began on June 6th, many senior German commanders, including Hitler himself, remained convinced for days that it was a diversion and the real invasion would still hit Calais. Panzer reserves that might have pushed the Allies back into the sea were held in place, waiting. For Werner Pluskat and the men of the 352nd, none of this mattered in the abstract. What mattered was that on the night of June 5th, there had been no specific warning. The Luftwaffe meteorological prediction of bad weather had given German commanders enough confidence that many of them were away from their posts, attending wargame exercises in Rennes. The sense of readiness that should have sharpened into high alert had softened into routine. The longest night. Sometime around 1 in the morning on June 6th, Werner Pluskat was woken by the sound he described as a low mechanical growl rolling across the water from the north, the engines of hundreds of aircraft. He reached his regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ocker, by phone. Ocker was dismissive. It was probably just an air raid, maybe another Allied bombing run. Nothing unusual. Pluskat had gone back to sleep when Ocker called back a short while later with a different tone. Paratroopers. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were dropping into Normandy behind the coastal defenses, trying to seize bridges and road junctions to prevent German reinforcements from moving. Alarms were sounding across the division. Pluskat and two of his officers jumped into their vehicle and drove 4 miles to their command bunker at the bluffs above Omaha Beach. What followed was a vigil of increasingly tense waiting. Through the observation slit of the bunker, scanning the English Channel with a scope, Pluskat saw nothing. The sea was dark, the horizon obscured by fog and mist. He called his higher headquarters looking for information. The reports coming in were confused, contradictory. Paratroopers landing here, fighting there, but the overall picture was murky. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps, had put his forces on alert and brought the 21st Panzer Division to readiness, but without clarity on where the main blow was coming from. Here is something worth pausing on. Less than 24 hours before all of this, General Marx had sat down at a war game in Rennes, playing out a theoretical scenario as the Allied commander. In his hypothetical exercise, the Allies landed in Normandy. He'd done this not because he expected it, but because it was one of many possibilities to be examined. The irony of that timing is almost cinematic. Back on the bluff, as the hours crept toward dawn, Pluskat kept returning to the scope. The paratrooper landings were clearly happening behind him. The sound of aircraft engines had been unmistakable, and scattered reports of fighting were coming in from inland positions. But the sea in front of him remained black and empty. The beaches were quiet. The obstacles stood undisturbed. The mines waited beneath the sand. Whatever was coming hadn't come yet. Then the sky began to lighten. 5,000 ships pointing straight for me. Dawn in Normandy on June 6th came as a pale gray wash spreading across the water from the east. The fog had thinned somewhat, but not cleared. Visibility was poor, improving slowly. Werner Pluskat pressed his eye against the observation scope and swept it across the horizon as he had done dozens of times through the night. And then his heart stopped. According to his own testimony, given first to historian Cornelius Ryan in interviews conducted in the mid-1950s, then confirmed on French television in 1964 on the 20th anniversary of the invasion, what he saw when the mist thinned enough to show the channel was a sight that defied comprehension. The entire horizon, from left to right as far as the scope could reveal, was covered in ships. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport ships loaded with men and vehicles and ammunition. Landing craft clustered around the larger vessels like iron beetles, all of them sitting in what appeared to be orderly rows extending to the very edge of vision. Dark silhouettes against the pewter sky, an armada the scale of which had never been seen in the history of warfare. He grabbed the telephone. His hands, by his own account, were shaking. When Pluskat told his regimental commander what he was seeing, thousands of ships, the entire horizon, straight ahead, Lieutenant Colonel Ocker's response was the kind of disbelief that comes from a mind encountering something genuinely impossible. He questioned the numbers. He questioned Pluskat's judgment. The exchange, immortalized in Cornelius Ryan's book and later dramatized in the 1962 film The Longest Day, captured something real about that moment. The German command structure's inability to accept the scale of what was happening. One of the lines used in the film, while dramatized, captures the spirit of the exchange perfectly. When Ocker asked where those thousands of ships were heading, Pluskat reportedly told him they were heading straight for him. Over 7,000 Allied naval vessels had crossed the English Channel. Nearly 1,200 warships, more than 4,000 landing craft. Approximately 12,000 aircraft were supporting the operation from the air. Around 156,000 Allied troops would land in Normandy that day, across 5 beaches, stretching more than 50 miles of coastline. Before any orders could be properly processed, before the telephone exchange could be completed, the world changed. The first salvos from the Allied naval guns tore across the sky and slammed into the bluffs of Omaha Beach with a force that the men inside the concrete bunkers felt in their bones. The naval bombardment that preceded the landings was designed to suppress the German coastal defenses, knock out strongpoints, and clear lanes through the beach obstacles. In practice, at Omaha, much of the firepower was directed at the bluffs and slightly inland. The German artillery positions were situated far enough back that most of the naval shells fell short of them. Pluskat's guns and their crews survived the initial bombardment largely intact, but the world had changed anyway. The beach that would not be taken quietly. At 6:30 in the morning, what military planners called H-hour, the landing craft carrying the first wave of American assault troops hit the beach at Omaha. What followed in the next hours was one of the most violent and costly engagements in American military history. The men in those landing craft had already been through hell before a single German fired a shot. They'd been loaded onto the boats miles out to sea, in swells between 3 and 6 feet, with 25-mile-per-hour winds churning the channel into a chaos of whitecaps. Dozens of soldiers were sick. Some boats had taken on water. The amphibious D.D. Sherman tanks, modified Shermans with collapsible canvas screens meant to allow them to float to shore, had been launched far too early in far too rough a sea. Of 32 tanks launched from the 741st Tank Battalion, 27 sank before reaching the shore. Their crews went with them. 3 couldn't launch in all. The infantry who survived the crossing arrived on a beach they had expected to be suppressed by those tanks and by the pre-landing bombardment. Neither had worked. The Allied bombers tasked with dropping their payloads on the German strongpoints had released their bombs too late or too early, missing the beach entirely. The 13,000 bombs dropped that morning landed mostly harmlessly inland, miles from their intended targets, because pilots flying through heavy cloud cover couldn't see the coastline and didn't want to risk hitting the landing craft. The naval guns had done some damage, but had not silenced the positions on the bluffs. When the ramps dropped on the landing craft and the men of the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division stepped out into chest-deep water, the German machine gun positions were fully manned, fully loaded, and waiting. The result was catastrophic. Some companies suffered 90% casualties in the first minutes. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, assigned to land opposite the Vierville Draw at Dog Green sector, was almost completely destroyed in the opening wave. Of 230 men, 212 became casualties by the end of D-Day. Soldiers drowned under the weight of their equipment. Men were shot in the water. The obstacles that the engineers were supposed to clear before the landing craft arrived were still in place, because the engineers had arrived simultaneously with the infantry rather than ahead of them. Landing craft drove onto mines. Steel hedgehogs tore holes in hulls. Men jumped into the surf and found it was over their heads, sank, clawed their way to the surface, were hit before they reached dry sand. From Pluskat's position on the bluffs, his artillery crews were directing fire down onto the beach as fast as they could work their guns. The 155mm pieces barked and roared, sending shells arcing down at ranges that had been pre-calculated for precisely this moment. Through the smoke and chaos, the German defenders in the strongpoints poured machine gun fire along the waterline. The MG-42 machine gun, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate so fast it sounded like tearing cloth rather than individual shots, swept back and forth across the sand. Mortar crews worked their tubes methodically. Every weapon on those bluffs had been positioned, pre-sighted, and rehearsed for exactly this scenario. And still, the Americans kept coming. Wave after wave of landing craft churned toward the beach. For every craft destroyed or turned back, more came. The Allied naval armada offshore was not a finite resource that could be depleted by a few guns on a bluff. It was essentially inexhaustible on the scale of a single morning's fighting. By mid-morning, Pluskat's battery was running low on ammunition. He called regiment for resupply and found the news grim. The roads were cut. Allied paratroopers inland had seized bridges and road junctions exactly as intended, and bringing ammunition forward to the coastal positions under Allied naval gunfire and air attack was proving extremely difficult. The Allied naval guns, guided by fire spotters on the beach and in the air, were adjusting their fire with increasing accuracy as the battle developed. Small groups of American soldiers had begun moving up through the draws, the natural gullies cut through the bluffs by water erosion, using grenades and satchel charges, moving in short rushes from one piece of cover to the next. The German defenders fought back ferociously, but the sheer numerical weight of what was landing below was unrelenting. By late morning, General Omar Bradley aboard the command ship Augusta had actually considered abandoning Omaha entirely and diverting subsequent waves to the British beaches to the east. The situation was that dire. What changed his mind was the gradual, bloody, expensive realization that scattered groups of American soldiers were actually making it to the high ground. The 352nd Infantry Division suffered around 1,200 casualties in those first 12 hours, killed, wounded, or captured. Roughly 10% of the division's total strength erased in a single day. Pluskat's last 2 guns fell silent by mid-morning, not because his crews had been killed, but because they ran out of ammunition. The Atlantic Wall at Omaha had given more resistance than at any other beach on D-Day, but it had not held. The truth question and why it matters. Now here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the account of Werner Pluskat seeing the Allied fleet is not without its complications. And those complications tell us something important about how history actually gets made. The primary source for Pluskat's story is his own testimony, given in interviews to journalist and historian Cornelius Ryan in the mid-1950s. Ryan was working on what would become The Longest Day, published in 1959, one of the most widely read works of military history ever produced. Ryan and his researchers spent nearly 3 years conducting over 3,000 interviews with D-Day survivors from every nation involved on both sides. The book was a landmark. It shaped how an entire generation understood what happened on June 6, 1944. When it was adapted into a film in 1962 with an all-star international cast including John Wayne, Richard Burton, Sean Connery, Henry Fonda, and Robert Mitchum, Pluskat himself served as one of the military consultants for the production. German actor Hans Christian Bleck portrayed him on screen. The scene where Pluskat scans the horizon and sees the armada became one of the most memorable moments in the film, but other veterans told a different story. Heinrich Severloh, a German machine gunner who fought at Omaha Beach that day, and whose memoir WN62 is considered one of the most detailed German ground-level accounts of the battle, wrote that Pluskat was not at his command position during the invasion, and was not, in his judgment, truthfully portrayed in the film. Some accounts suggest Pluskat may have been absent from his command bunker during the critical pre-dawn hours, possibly in Caen, and that the famous account of watching the fleet appear was either embellished or appropriated from someone else who did not survive the battle to contradict it. One competing claimant to the distinction of being the first German officer to sight the fleet was Oberleutnant Walter Ohmsen, commander of the Crispec battery, who reportedly spotted the Allied armada through a battery rangefinder around the same time. Other analysts have noted that German radar stations, including installations near Cherbourg, had detected the fleet approaching well before dawn, which would mean any number of German officers had technical knowledge of the armada's approach before Pluskat claims to have personally seen it with his own eyes. What do we make of all this? The honest answer is that the fog of war extends into memory as much as it does into the water below those bluffs. It is entirely possible that Pluskat arrived at his command post during the early hours of June 6th, as he described, and that his account of pressing his eye to a scope and watching an impossible horizon of ships materialize from the darkness is broadly accurate. It is equally possible that some aspects were shaped or sharpened in the retelling, as often happens with accounts gathered years after traumatic events from participants with a natural stake in their own story. What is not in dispute is this: Werner Pluskat survived the war. His men fired their guns at Omaha Beach until their ammunition was gone. The 352nd Infantry Division fought one of the most effective defensive actions of D-Day. And on April 23, 1945, Pluskat was present at Magdeburg when he surrendered alongside Generalleutnant Kurt Dittmar to soldiers of the United States 30th Infantry Division. He lived until June 11, 2002, dying in Heilbronn, Germany at the age of 89 or 90. Until his death, he maintained that the sight of the Allied armada materializing from the morning haze on June 6, 1944, was the moment he knew Germany had lost the war. That moment, whether experienced exactly as he described it or shaped somewhat in the telling, captures something genuinely true about what D-Day was. It was the morning when the full weight of American industrial power Allied planning and sheer determined will arrived on a stretch of Norman sand and refused to be stopped. It was the morning when the Atlantic Wall cracked. It was the morning that the war changed. The 352nd Infantry Division gave Germany its most effective defense of D-Day. At Omaha, they came closer than anywhere else to making the Allied commanders consider pulling back. And even that wasn't enough. By evening, 34,000 American soldiers had come ashore. The beachhead existed. The road to Paris was not closed. The war ran on for another 11 months before it ended, and the chain of events that would eventually put Allied flags on the Reichstag all started right there on those bluffs, on that beach, in those early morning hours when a German artillery major pressed his eye against a scope and saw what he described as an armada beyond comprehension. That image, whatever its precise historical truth, is not a bad way to understand what D-Day meant. If you made it to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you being here. These are the kinds of stories that remind us that history isn't just movements of armies on a map, it's individual people standing in the dark, making decisions, watching things happen that change the world. If that's the kind of content you're here for, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to help the channel grow, leaving a comment or giving the video a like makes a bigger difference than you might think. As always, thank you for watching War Chronicles 1940.